Was good, yeah. So because of the test server, I had the benefit of already testing out the Boreas Nerf. Important to note, it is only a concept as of this moment. So they're still asking for feedback from test server or Forerunner people or players to figure out if they've maybe overdone it, underdone it, if they could do something different. So it isn't certain that we're going to get this nerf, or however you want to call it, but let's get into what they've done and see how I feel about it. Obviously, before we get into the results of the test, we need to be on the same page when it comes to what they actually changed. And for that, we have the old Boreas on the left and the new Boreas on the right side. So when deployed, deals 200% magic damage to up to 10 enemies in a wide range and inflicts freeze on them. This effect triggers one time every 16 seconds afterwards. During Eternal Ice Haven, the skill triggered or the skill's trigger interval is reduced by an extra 10 seconds. So what they changed is they reduced the damage of Frozen Purification by 20%, as well as reducing the actual cooldown by a second. So it's kind of like a buff, but it's only a minor one, because during Eternal Ice Haven, which is the effect he gains in his ultimate, it reduces the internal trigger interval by 9 seconds, which is going to be, for example, on the left side going down from 16 seconds to 6 seconds, as well as also on the right side from 15 seconds down to 6 seconds, because it's 10 and then 9 seconds respectively. Furthermore, the freeze triggered by Frozen Purification is on the old Boreas 2 seconds and on the new Boreas only a single second. Lastly, the skill states that it deals the magical damage to 10 enemies in a wide range. Now the big question is, what is the wide range? How big is it? And that's what we're going to have a look at now, because not only did they change the skill and reduce the modifiers, they've also kind of fixed or nerfed the biggest benefit of Boreas, which was this incredible range when it came to his Frozen Purification. So before, we actually had 4.5 tiles, so you can kind of count it, which is 4.5 tiles, and now it went down to 3.5 tiles all around Boreas. Now, obviously, you can see a really, really big difference when it comes to like overall area coverage, and that's not the only thing we're going to do. Obviously, we're going to have a look at in-game examples too, because this is kind of hard to imagine and kind of hard to guess. Is it now really that worse? What kind of impact is this going to have? Alright, so for the first example, we're going to have a look at Gear 321, because the enemies are stationary and we can actually count the tiles from Boreas to the enemies. So this is old Boreas and his range. Right here we can see the freeze and then count the tiles. That's 1 tile, 2 tiles, 3 tiles, hitting into the 4th tile, 1 tile to the side, as well as then 2 tiles to the side. So at least minimum this area is covered. And yeah, that's basically him hitting in the old style. So obviously now it's time to get a reference, time to have a look at how the new Boreas is actually going to hit, at least with the concept that's there at the moment. So right there, here we go. We're just going to place down our Boreas and then obviously freeze the enemies. Nothing happens. So now you might be wondering, why is nothing happening? Where's the Frozen Purification? Isn't it on deployment? The answer is the enemies are actually out of range. The enemies are actually out of range, which is why Frozen Purification isn't actually triggering. And if we count the tiles, we're going to see 1 tile, 2 tiles, 3 tiles, and it's technically 3.5. But this enemy is actually past 3.5 tiles, so in the later row of the tile, if that makes sense. I don't even know why they're doing it in half tiles, but good enough. So Boreas can't hit past 3 tiles anymore. Right here we're going to trigger his ultimate just so we can see it trigger a bit more and then kind of try to gauge the range. So enemy moves into range, Boreas freezes, but he only freezes one of the enemies. So he doesn't even have a hitbox here anymore. So it's not to the side, nor is it actually, it's not even 3 tiles to the side completely. So then we just wait for the next hit, and once he's actually here, he's still now able to hit. So it's at least those tiles right here. And then with the half tiles crossing over, that's why he can freeze both of them. But he still isn't able to hit 4 tiles anymore. So yeah, what does it actually now impact? How does it actually have an impact on him? Obviously the answer is Arena. what everyone used Boreas for in Arena is obviously him and his ability to pretty much hit the whole arena field because of this 4.5 tail range everywhere. Now, luckily enough, we have AoE Arena at the moment, so we can just take out all those units and bring in just Boreas. So something that was rather common to do with Boreas or in general was Boreas on this tile right here, still being able to hit all the enemies. So then you were able to use a Comet right here because the Comet did need to be closer to the enemies to actually be able to hit them. So let's have a look if that's impacted, if you can still even hit the enemies right there. So we just bring in Boreas where we normally would place him and where he would be able to. So in this position, Boreas should be able to actually hit all the enemies right here. And yeah, you gotta excuse the enemy. It's just test server arena sucks. We don't really have any worthwhile enemies to face. So Boreas is able to exactly hit a single enemy. He's able to hit a single enemy. So going right here and then half the tile hitting the enemy. And that's actually honestly already about it. So no more Boreas hitting all across the arena. He is just hitting basically right here. That's about his limit. So you would need to move him to the side so he's able to take care of all the other enemies. So now that we've taken a look at a couple examples of the ranges, let's actually just go back to it, have a quick look at it again, and then kind of realize it is actually quite a big change. It is actually quite substantial what he can't do anymore now that they've changed his range. But obviously that's not the last. The things that they've changed, we have further changes. For example, Chilling Blow. When enemies are inflicted with freeze, they will also receive anti-healing. When attacking enemies inflicted with freeze deals 55% extra damage. This 55% extra damage got reduced down to 40%, so minus 15%, as well as a slight buff, which is increasing the anti-heal duration from 3 seconds up to 4 seconds. But you didn't really notice the anti-heal before anyway, but that's just that. So we have less damage, but longer anti-heal duration. Next one, and obviously last but not least, is going to be his ultimate, Frosty Endowment. He activates Eternal Ice Haven and increases his damage by 250%. Each attack will reduce the trigger interval of the next Frozen Purification, so the AoE hit, by a single second. This effect lasts for 30 seconds. Eternal Ice Haven itself, when allies inflict freeze on enemies, deals additional massive damage. The additional damage is affected by the duration of freeze inflicted and has a cooldown of 1.5 seconds. So a couple of things to talk about. For example, the first change you can see is the ultimate cost. They've actually reduced the ultimate cost by around 15%, going down from 1,200 down to 1,000 ultimate cost. So he now can cycle his ultimate faster and also use his ultimate earlier on first deployment. Secondly, they've changed the ultimate duration. The duration went down from 30 seconds all the way down to 25 seconds, so minus 5 seconds. And then the most massive change is obviously the damage, which they reduced by a total of 75%. So instead of getting a 2.5 multiplier, he only now has a 1.75 multiplier. Eternal Ice Haven actually stays the same, but in the description of Eternal Ice Haven it states that the additional damage is based on the duration of the freeze, and that is also something they've changed in his kit, as you remember, which is the freeze now isn't 2 seconds anymore, no, it's now 1 second. So he's also dealing even less additional damage through Eternal Ice Haven. So overall the changes seem pretty rough, but it's obviously up to us to figure out how rough the changes exactly are, and that's what I'm going to do. So around a week ago I've uploaded a video which was titled Damage Testing Every AoE Mage, and we're just going to repeat the test because in that one we've actually had the buffed Boreas. So we're going to repeat the test, which is a very simple Boreas plus Epic Lord and then obviously as many support characters as possible. In this case, a Laurel, Dolores, Hollow, Elowen, then Vortex just to keep Mary alive and Mary for some sustain / crowd control, and then Volker for the despawn timer for Laurel. So I've already ran this fight and now it's time to have a look at how does he compare to his old values, or how does he exactly compare to all other AoE mages we've already tested to kind of see where he's now pretty much lying. So let's get back to that. All right, so first things first was the time survived. That was just to like differentiate between certain mages if they've killed the same number of enemies, but in general it's the same conclusion. He can still solo 120, but if you take a look at the numbers, we have Boreas at 5 minutes 35 seconds and then Boreas Nerf at 6 minutes 45 seconds. So it took him a minute and 10 seconds longer to actually finish gear rate 120 in the same gear with the same stats and the same team formation. Secondly, total damage. Boreas' total damage went up from 164 million all the way to 173 million, but that just has to do with the fact that he took longer in the fight, so he himself wasn't able to do as much damage, either not completely killing the enemies straight away or in general just taking longer and then allowing enemies to heal. So he just had a slight increase in damage, but in general it wasn't actually an increase, because obviously we've then calculated the DPS, which is by taking the total damage and then dividing it by the seconds they actually took to finish the fight, which then gives us Boreas, Viona, Karmet, and then Boreas Nerf's damage. So let's have a look at the damage numbers. Boreas, before his nerf, was able to do around 489,000 damage per second, with Viona coming in at around 459,000 and then Karmet 452,000. Obviously that's not completely accurate, because if you're able to kill the enemies faster, then you have less enemies to hit and then less damage, which is why Karmet's number is, for example, lower than Viona's, but in general it still gives you a very good idea of how much damage they were actually able to do. So now we have Boreas. Boreas is now actually below Karmet and Viona at only 427,000 damage per second, which also obviously still has to do with his ultimate and with the fact that he applies anti-heal, which kind of reduces his damage. So in general, you can kind of conclude that he was too broken before, because even with anti-heal, he was doing way more damage than, for example, Viona and Karmet. But now his damage is basically similar to what a Karmet and a Viona are actually able to put out. So they've kind of taken him away out of super broken and turned them into kind of like Karmet's brother, really. Next up, we have kind of my general sheet of is he able to clear and what changed when it comes to his kit. So, can he still do gear rate 1? Yes. Obviously, let's have a look at Boreas before the nerf. Boreas was able to do gear rate 1, gear rate 2, gear rate 3, arena, void, pretty much every content in the game that actually had a range tile. So now on to Boreas Nerf. Boreas Nerf is still able to do gear rate 1. He can still do gear rate 121, but he just requires a bit more gear. It's nothing big. It's not like he's now completely bad, but he just requires slightly more gear to perform the same as a Boreas. But a Boreas was super broken before, for example, being able to clear gear rate 121 with a crit damage main set and potentially even broken set, which was just too much. And he's now kind of more in line when it comes to performance. So as long as you put him into a Sorbonne Arcana set with reasonable stats, he's still going to be able to demolish gear rate 1. Same goes for gear rate 2. He's still able to clear 221. One thing of note is though, you gotta be a bit more careful when it comes to his ultimate timing. So now he can't just one-shot every enemy, even how far they are away. You kind of need to wait for them to get closer, so it brings him more in line with the way you needed to play mages in general. Gear rate 3. Before, Boreas was able to deal with the left side of gear rate 3 as well as in particularly good gear even with the right side, which is now impossible. Not completely impossible, but I've tried him with very, very good gear on a 25 tier of Twilight, and the dude wasn't able to perform. He wasn't actually able to clear neither the left nor the right side. So arena, you've already kind of seen the arena that I'm able to deal with, so it's actually up to either the Forerunner people or them figuring out a way for us to get reasonable arena opponents before I can actually give you an exact example of how strong he is in arena. But from what you've seen, it definitely requires people to change the way they approach Boreas. They can't just place him down and he's going to kill the whole area. It's just not going to work. So Void Drift, obviously in Void Drift, Boreas was actually destroying everything with ridiculous modifiers, but now he's still going to work in Void Drift. He's still going to perform. But it's kind of the same as with gear rate 1. You just need to give him slightly better gear or even potentially in some cases way better gear to get the same effect as he had before, which still makes him a very viable hero, but again kind of brings him more in line when it comes to AoE mages with, for example, a Karmet, a Vjörna, or then even, for example, a Demi. So overall, the way they've changed him is probably quite crucial. You can't really judge the impact of him having reduced range. It definitely requires you to change the way you approach certain stages, and also means you need to be more careful with the way you trigger his timings. But overall, he doesn't feel like he's bad. He's definitely not Charmier tier when it comes to mages. So before we end this video, I'm going to give you the same feedback I've given the developers, because they're obviously still actively asking for feedback. So for Boreas, my feedback was, feels underwhelming because he was so strong before. You really kind of feel the loss. He can't just do everything and you just place him down and you win. You really feel the impact of the reduced range, and even if he does the damage, it isn't the same anymore, kind of deal. The loss of range is most likely a good thing, because it was too much. It was really too much, but it would definitely require more planning and rethinking on how to approach him in certain stages, and some autos are probably not going to work when it comes to Void Rift. Overall, it's still probably a good nerf. Now onto the kit. Faster ult cycle is definitely a good change, because you can't just take away, you also need to give back. So he's now able to cycle his ultimate faster, which then just works well with his intended kit, which is actually just a synergy between him and different teammates and making freeze teams more powerful, or in general actually possible. Now the longer anti-heal, as I've already briefly mentioned, you really don't notice it, and it doesn't actually have an impact. Obviously also with the fact that anti-heal is a very specific debuff, which only really comes into play in Gear Rate 1, and potentially Void Rift when it comes to those mages that actually get healed through taking enemy souls. But even there, you're better off just killing them with marksmen instead of trying to apply anti-heal to them. So on the damage, it might be a bit too low, but I'm not quite certain about it. So they could technically still add around 5 to 10% more damage back to every skill. So for example, the ultimate getting around 10% damage more and the passive getting 5% more, just so you don't really have that difference between the way he was and the way he is. But in general, his damage, as I've already mentioned, kind of now falls in line with what a Vjörna and a Karmet can do, which obviously still isn't bad and is still top of the line when it comes to AoE mages. Now, a potential problem I've noticed is that if you had a A0 Karmet before, you could go into arena, and if your gear was good enough, if you timed it well enough, you were easily able to beat the A3, A5 Boreas. Even in Guild Wars, you haven't really noticed it. Now, the problem that could actually crop up is the fact that, on that note, let's actually have a look at his awakenings so you can kind of understand what I mean. But in general, the issue I'm scared of is that now people that have an A3, A5 Boreas are actually going to have a major advantage in comparison to other people trying to use Boreas for the same task. So let's actually have a quick look there. So first awakening, during the ultimate, the trigger chance of the hero's talent increases by 40%. So we actually have, let's have a look. A 50% chance to inflict freeze with the basic attack, which obviously is quite nice, and also this freeze being 3 seconds definitely allows it to do more damage than before through the use of Eternal Ice Haven, which is obviously active in the ultimate. But the A1 isn't really why I fear it. It's this right here, A3, Frozen Purification's damage increases by 50%. So why it wasn't really a problem before was that no matter if it was A0, A3 Boreas, he just killed enemies. As long as you had good enough gear, he was killing them. He was pretty much overkilling them, so you didn't really notice the difference between A0 and A3. But if we now take a look at Frozen Purification, he actually goes from 180 to 230%, which is obviously more than he had in his base form, but it obviously gets reduced through the additional freeze damage and blah blah. But it kind of makes his Frozen purification fall more in line with the way it was before. So the A3 is definitely going to kind of give him more power back. And then lastly is the A5, which increases the ultimate duration by 10 seconds, so bringing it up to 35 seconds instead of 25 seconds. So now you kind of have a anti-nerf by still getting 5-second longer ult duration than pre-nerf Boreas. So I might be overcomplicating stuff. He might not even find a place in arena still, but that's just one thing I am rather scared of, the fact that there's going to be a big difference in between A0, A3 and A5 Boreas users. So this concludes my Boreas test, and we see each other in the next one.